The African continent. It's a fairly busy place. But if you were to ask people at a certain time, they would assume that it was very quiet. At any point in history, if you were to travel all over Africa, some people assume that it would be very little people with very little activity. So when foreigners finally came to Africa and started writing about Africa, why is it that on every shore, on every place, every country in Africa, there was at least one great civilization with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people, some of them larger than some of the most well known civilizations in the world. And a lot of their technology was beyond those of those people. To put it into perspective, let's take Madagascar as an example. So, Madagascar is human free for about all of human history, even though humans have traveled far and wide to Australia, America, and everywhere. But Madagascar, right next to Africa, is completely free of humans until the Bantu expansion. But wait, they say that the Bantus were not the first people to land in Madagascar. It actually was the Indonesian slash Melanesian people who traveled through islands. But wait, there's one more. The Arabs would later come in and land on the shores of Madagascar. All of this taking place within 1,000 years of each other. So millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years, no activity. And within 1,000 years of each other, there is a lot of activity from three different nations at the exact same time, expanding for completely different reasons and landing at the exact same ports, bringing in their own individual structures that have nothing to do with each other within 1,000 years of each other. It's interesting when you look at the individuals that live on these islands that they still bear the marks of these migrations, mainly Bantu and Malagasy people coming together to form one type of nation, and then obviously a minority Indian and Arab push that would affect them. But you can obviously tell that the majority of their DNA is the two sides of black, the Indonesian slash Melanesian and the Bantu African. Okay, this is fine maybe for Madagascar that they have this miraculous thing where things happen at the exact same time, but it also happens almost everywhere else in Africa. For example, the Nubian civilization seems to occur at the exact same time that the Egyptian civilization occurs. For a coincidence? It's a hell of a coincidence. Okay, but what about when the Bantus got to East Africa? Well, they seem to get to East Africa about 1,000 years after the Nilotics finally descend down to southern Africa after pretending it doesn't exist. Not only that, they seem to get there at about 500 years, within 500 years of Afro-Asiatic people deciding after thousands of years not to go down to Africa, to go down to East Africa. And of course, there's other people in that region, but they seem to be obliterated. And remember, in East Africa, just under the Horn of Africa, written by the Greeks and Romans, there is a thriving civilization somewhere there called Rapta. And we don't know whether the Nilotics built it or the Bantu built it, but we know that there's a civilization right there. So, who exactly built it? But let's not go into that. What I want to illustrate for you is how coincidental it is that just at the moment that the Romans get there, there's a civilization. Had they gotten there 1,000 years earlier, had they gotten there 500 years earlier, there would have been nothing. But as soon as they get there, there's a civilization. And this happens over and over again. So, 500 years before the Kingdom of Congo, as soon as they get there, the all of a sudden there's a thriving civilization that has a language structure and has multiple kings and has a teaming structure and it has duels with two different kingdoms and they have their own religion and they're willing to accept the Catholic religion within, like as soon as they get there there's people. But 500 years, within 500 years of almost any place you go into history in Africa, when the people get there and they start writing about them, for some reason it was either very tribal or empty. But when you check, it's neither empty nor tribal. Once writing is invented, suddenly it's almost like the opposite of what people atheists say about religion. That before there was cameras, miracles used to happen all the time, and then all of a sudden cameras came, and now miracles almost never happen. But if you look at Africa, right, before there was writing, before there was even one piece of writing in Africa, we have no civilization whatsoever. As soon as foreigners come in and they land and they write that they see the natives, so anywhere they land, no matter where they land, whether it's in southern Africa, whether it's in central southern Africa, western southern Africa, eastern southern Africa, West Equatorial Africa, East Equatorial Africa, North Africa, North Africa. It doesn't matter where they land. They seem to find civilizations. But here's the part that kicks me. When they get there, they're at their height. Coincidentally, all of them are at their height. Ethiopia was at its height. Somalia was at its height. Zimbabwe was at its height. The Swahili coast was at its height. All the way down to South Africa, they were all at their height, the highest they ever reached. So 500 years before anybody started documenting this. So let's go back. So it's about the 1300s where all of them just all of a sudden start having this giant push and kick as civilizations. But if we go back 1,000 years before that, 300 AD, 300 BC, or just zero, let's go straight to zero, where the assumption is there's no kingdom of Congo. There's nothing there really. There's like pygmies living in that area and Khoisan people. You go down South Africa, it's more Khoisan people, but they're not building any civilization around. In Madagascar, the first Indonesians or whatever you want to call them are coming in. In the Swahili coasts, apparently there's nothing, even though the Greeks wrote that there was some civilizations in that area, but they say there was nothing. And then you go to Somalia, you go to all these other places, and they have some remnants of civilizations. Obviously, they have good civilizations in that area, but they're nowhere near their height. And then you have the places in zero, they're taken over by the Greeks and these other people, the Romans. They're starting to lose their power. And then all of a sudden, the Arab invasion happens. So Arabia invents Islam, right? Within that time, Arabia invents Islam. So everything in Africa and near Africa seems to jump at the exact same time. And while it's jumping in Africa, Europe enters a so-called Dark Ages. I know some people call it the medieval era, but I still call it the Dark Ages because a lot of technology that they had, they lost. A lot of things that they had already discovered went away, and it moved to the Islamic world. to reintroduce it into Europe. But if you look at Africa, they seem to have the exact same jump that Islam has. Empire starts spreading, medicine starts growing, metallurgy is there. The Sabaean culture that's right next to Somalia grows within, a couple years. My only point is that the only way to resolve this is to think of two grand solutions. And one of them is that there's something that pulls all of these people into this location and makes them jump. So, in other words, there's something that happens at the time that is trade related that brings everyone into Africa. Or, second, that these civilizations are actually older than we think. Now, I know what you're thinking. How sophisticated were these civilizations really? Think about it. How sophisticated were they? Well, we know that the Somalians, the Ethiopians, Egyptians, North Africans, West Africans, Central Africans, they all had books. The only people who didn't have books, according to the history, were the Southern Africans, which makes this passage of people, at least the Portuguese, first landing in Congo, seem very strange indeed, as we read. Besides this, he assembled the governors from different provinces at a place arranged for them to meet in, and told them publicly that whoever possessed idols or anything else contrary to the Christian religion must give them up to the deputies appointed to receive them, and that all who kept them back would be burnt and receive no pardon. This threat being at once put into execution, in less than a month were brought to the court all the idols, sorcery books, and magic writings which had been worshipped as gods, and truly great numbers of these things were collected, for each person worshipped what most suited his taste. Now, I want you to, we could keep reading all the way down here, but I want you to stop here. This is the Kingdom of Congo, and they're talking about the fact that these people had sorcery books and magic writings. Books and writings. This, by the way, is when the Portuguese first arrived in the Kingdom of Congo, and they convinced some of the early people to convert and get rid of non Christian religious symbols. And right there with them are books and writings. But books aren't supposed to exist in this place, are they? I thought books were not invented in this region. But keep in mind, these are sorcery books, not books of Islam. So it's not Islamic books, not books of some other version of Christianity. As we continue to read, this becomes more obvious. For each person worshipped what most suited his taste, apart from any sense of rule or reason, so that there were numerous demons of strange and frightful forms, many held in great reverence, winged dragons which they nourished in their private houses, giving them the most costly viands to eat, others serpents of horrible shape, large goat, tigers, and various monstrous animals, and the more they were ugly and deformed, the more they held them in honor, regarding as sacred unclean birds, such as bats, screech owls, and like. In fine, they chose for gods serpents, beasts, birds, plants, trees, various kinds of wood and stone, carving also on the wood and stone representations of the above to form pictures, and not only did they worship living animals, but also those stuffed with straw. The act of adoration was performed in various ways, but always in the direction of humility, sometimes throwing themselves on their knees and taking up mouthful of earth, covering the face with dust, and making prayer to the idols, both in word and gestures, and offering sacrifices of the best things they possessed. They had also their sorcerers, who told these simple people that the idols spoke to them, and deceived them so far that if any sick presented themselves and were healed, the sorcerers attributed the cure to the idols, but if they were not healed, they said the idols were angry. This was the sort of religion practiced amongst the people of Congo before they received baptism and the knowledge of the living God. Now the king, having collected together from the different houses in the city all these false gods, commanded that in the same place where a short time before he had fought and conquered his brother's people, everyone should bring a piece of wood till a great pile was raised, and there cast in the idols and all other things which they had treated before as sacred, so that all might be burned. Then he assembled all these people together, and in place of their idols gave them crosses and images of the saints which he had received from the Portuguese, and commanded each of these lords to build a church and erect crosses in the city of the province where they ruled, as he had given them example. After this, he announced to them and to the people that he had sent ambassadors to Portugal to bring back priests who would teach them religion and administer the Holy Sacrament. I'll mention later in another video why I think books were actually around, maybe not common, but around in these civilizations where you can see the people still dressed in their noble attire and then dressed up as Christians. I'm going to address why they would have books back then. But for now, remember the book I read is from the 1500s, so that's the oldest. And you can see in the whole context that they're talking about people who are basically tribal human beings, but they talk about books. And I don't want to hear, oh, what do they mean by books? We know what the hell a book is. And then he even specifies and says with writings. And later he says pictures in another place because he knows the difference between writing a book and pictures. And he didn't write that by mistake. Unfortunately, they burned those books, so oops.